Hello everyone. I don't know who watches our videos, who doesn't watch, and where, and which country, which city, but those who do watch might have noticed we were repeating them for the last 3 weeks. That was because I was in England visiting my family. But now I have returned and we are going to resume normal program scheduling. And here's our wonderful rabbi.
It's a pleasure to go back to normalcy now, and that is Parashat Shavua in person. The parasha is Balak, and Balak is it's like an enigma in there when we're talking about Balak and Bilam. After all, I think it started, when you talk about Bilam, who was called upon the king of Moab, Balak, to go and curse the people of Israel. Can you imagine? So that they can win the impending war against them. They were afraid. That's how the Torah begins to say. Balak ben Tzipor melech leMoab, he was appointed the king at that time, and he was afraid that Israel was conquering everywhere, wherever they went. And he was afraid as well that Moab is going to be losing all their ground. So he went and heard of this very famous sorcerer and magician. But he was a prophet who had, in a way, dialogues with God. Can you imagine? We always read in Yigdal, we say, "V'lo kam kemo she'od, navi kemo she'od." There was no other prophet that stood in Israel like Moshe. And our rabbis say, "Israel, only in Israel, but outside Israel, I mean, among the non-Jews, it was somebody like Bilam." He was really a prophet because God communicated with him as well. And so Balak went to Bilam to go and curse the people of Israel. Now, there are a few questions over there. It shows how Bilam was really an anti-Semite, because he didn't care what God wanted to do or no. After all, there was a communication. Balak sent emissaries, and more important emissary than the other, even when at the very beginning Bilam said, God doesn't let me go with you. And he went and sent more emissary, more important emissary. Ultimately, he didn't care what God said. What God said, you cannot curse the people of Israel because they are blessed already by me. And so therefore, you shouldn't go. But Bilam decided to ignore that, and he went with them to go and curse the Jewish people. Now, it's very interesting that our rabbis, and they compare the situation of Bilam and the situation of our patriarch Abraham. What their philosophies and their qualities as people, as person in their personalities, and it's so interesting that we see in Pirkei Avot, our rabbis make a point to tell us what the characteristic of Abraham and what are the characteristic of Bilam. He said, what are the characteristics of Abraham? Is in the way that Pirkei Avot tells us not about Abraham and Bilam, but he said about the characteristics of the disciples of Abraham and the disciple of Bilam. He said, if you have the disciple of Abraham is Ayin Tovah, and also you have a Nefesh Nemucha, which is the Ruach Nemucha, and Nefesh Shefela, which means, in other words, that some will have benevolent eye and have a low spirit, which is a humble spirit, or also nefesh chava and nefesh nemucha, which mean a mixed soul. Those are qualities that you find in Abraham. He said those are the disciples of Abraham. But if the other way around, which is what we call evil eye, arrogant spirit, and greedy soul, those are the disciples of Balaam. Now the question is, why our rabbi speak about the disciples of Abraham or the disciple of Balaam? Why don't say about Balaam and Abraham, that Abraham is like that? He's got this kind of spirit, and the opposite is Balaam. So it's very important what our rabbi is telling us is really, you know a person according to who are those who follow that person. It's not, many times this is what happened in our world. Important people, politicians, so many people, they go and they are supposed to represent us. Ultimately, they don't represent us. They decide for us what we need and what we don't need. So therefore, they are well spoken. They dress properly in such a way. And so what happened is that if you were to look at Balaam, he's a prophet. He's got prophecy. He's well spoken. In fact, one of the great oratory of poetry was Balaam. There is none like him. And also, he would dress, most probably look like Abraham. So what happened is, if you're talking between Abraham and Balaam, our rabbis want to tell us many times you cannot tell this somebody like Balaam that really the real anti-Semite, because originally what he wanted to do is curse the people of Israel of his own, and ultimately he had to do what God told him to do, but to bless. So our rabbi is telling us, the disciples is when you want to know a person, see about who are the disciples of that person. Who are the followers of that person? What is the impact that ultimately with his personality does for other people? And then you know what kind of person it is. And this is the difference between Abraham and Balaam, what our rabbi is telling us. Shabbat Shalom.